This story is told in the perspective of a female. I'll begin by giving a little background information first. At the time this happened, I was 16, working at a chain coffee place while in high school. I'm 19 and in college now, which was 7 hours away from said place. This happened at a time in my life in which I was super shy and had a tough time standing up for myself. In retrospect, I could have handled it a lot better. I used to work the closing shifts with my best friend after school from 3 to 10 p.m. or from 5 to 10 p.m. We worked at a relatively dead store, so we spent most of our time playing music and talking. We both did our duties like taking out the trash and restocking, etc. However, both of us always dreaded taking the trash out as we had to go out back as the dumpsters were behind the store in a dimly lit area next to a sketchy liquor store. One night, a man came in. It wasn't unusual to have customers come near closing, but it was just as uncommon to see anyone we didn't already know. Our store was mostly just regulars. He was lanky and probably around 30, and I mostly just remembered his eyes. They were piercing, the type that never break a stare, to which I found somewhat attractive. The way he spoke was short and concise, just ordering a small hot latte. I made his order and that was it. I told my friend about how I thought he was attractive, and we then started referring to him as the small hot latte guy. He came in a bunch of times after that, each time staying a little longer and talking a little more and more. One day, he had come in with a woman, presumably his girlfriend. I remember I felt a little weird, like she was staring at me, or they had spoken out about me beforehand. She glanced over at him and said, "Oh, well, she's pretty." I didn't think much of it and said thank you, served them, and thought that would be the end of it. He then began showing up and talking to me a lot without her, and started off as being friendly and eventually flirty. Initially, I was just flattered. But being underage and immature, I didn't even think about the fact that it was kind of alarming. He began to stay for a while. Sometimes he would bring a laptop or a notebook, and I could feel him staring at me and listening to our conversations. But at that point, I wasn't getting creepy vibes from him, as my coworker and I had dealt with our fair share of creeps before. Fast forward to a few weeks later, he then somehow got my number. I have no idea as to how he got it. He texted me and somehow I still wasn't creeped out. We would talk about music a lot and then I began to learn more about him. He was in his 30s and had prior problems with substance abuse that he really never got into. He went back to school for art and would show some of his pieces. He'd also send a lot of pictures of nature. I thought they were nice, I guess, but looking back they were actually pretty creepy. For example, a picture of his backyard sent at 3 a.m. He'd stay and work on his art as well and told me he barely enjoyed the hot lattes and that he just wanted to come and see me. At one point, he would then come in and begin giving me gifts, and this was to the point where I finally started realizing I did not like the situation. At first, it was just little snacks or drinks. Being nice, I would accept it, but would never eat or drink them, and it wasn't that I necessarily thought he had ill intentions, I just had a hard time of accepting gifts. One night, he had brought me a book about one of his favorite artists. I reluctantly took it, even though I had tried to decline it before. I remember telling him about one of my favorite musicians and sent him a link to a performance I really liked. However, he started being kind of sexual while still talking about the song. He began talking super suggestively, and I would laugh it off and decline when he'd ask to send pictures. I began talking less and less and told my friend about the situation, to which he agreed that it was getting creepy and that I should maybe change my schedule. I told her I'll be fine. Big mistake. He'd still come every week at closing time, and he'd even stay in his car till we were closed. Meaning he'd watch me go into the back to take the trash out. Sooner or later, I began making excuses as to why I couldn't talk and began going out to the back of the store when I'd see him. He then sent me a bunch of texts about how graceful I looked while working. He kept texting me and I told him that I didn't want to talk to him anymore, but he wouldn't get the hint. He would send a bunch of messages describing how much I meant to him and how he wouldn't be okay. I started freaking out right then and there, blocked his number, but still I returned to work. For some reason, I honestly thought he'd stop coming. I was wrong. I felt uneasy the whole shift. My friend said that if he came to just go to the back and wait it out, and when I saw his car coming, my heart sank into the pit of my stomach. I was on the verge of tears and hurried to the back. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't decipher what exactly was being said. Then, about 10 minutes later, she came to the back. I could visibly see that she was upset. We ended up both just crying and hugging each other. It was at this point where it was time to take out the trash and lock up, and we both felt okay. I was opening the door while carrying like 3 bags of trash and saw something on the ground. I was confused at first, then realized what I saw. It was flowers and a note. I felt sick to my stomach and looked around the parking lot but didn't see his car. I threw them out immediately and told my friend I didn't want to read the note. She read it and told me I had to. It was something along the lines of, "I've never felt so connected to someone. You're breaking my heart. Please don't do this. I'm sorry." Looking back, I honestly didn't lead him on, but initially I just felt as if I was in the wrong. Nonetheless, we turned the corner to take the trash out and both prayed the parking lot was empty. It wasn't. Let's just say that the trash was not going to be taken out that night. I continued working there, and I still work there on my breaks from college, and I now have different hours, and I never saw him again. This happened to my friend and I when we were both kids, and every time I look back on this, I remember how grateful I am to be alive. This happened in the 90s. When I was about 9 or 10, my family had moved into an old house that was at least 70 years old at the time. It was a large 2-storied house and was in pretty good condition for a house that old. Most houses like this one would normally tear down after 30 years, depending on the material it was made out of and how well you maintained them. In this case, the previous owner obviously kept things in pretty good condition. Anyway, we had lived far out into the countryside as my parents weren't the type to mess around with cities or towns. A few miles from my house, there's a massive national forest that went on for miles across acres of land. Then, maybe about a couple of miles into the woods, there's a small sugar shack that had been abandoned for years. My friends and I used to go on long walks into the forest to the shack after school as a sort of break. Our chill spot, basically. The shack was a bit of a walk on a gravel road into the woods, but it was in the middle of a large clearing, so you couldn't miss it. One day, my best friend Matt and I had just got out of school for the summer, and we decided to stop by the shack before heading home. Even though it was the last day of school, we still needed a break to take our minds off all the stress we had on top of us. We walk about a good mile into the woods and then stumble upon the shack, relieved we were finally there. Matt and I go into the shack and sit down talking about what we do for the summer and whatnot when we hear something loud coming down the gravel road. At first, we thought that it might have been the sound of construction vehicles at the demolishing site just a few miles back. However, we peek out of the shack and see a large white van coming down the gravel road. It stops a few feet in front of the shack, and we see two men get out and start to approach us. Unfortunately, they must have heard us because they start yelling at us to get out of the shack. Whoever they were looked as if they meant trouble, and there weren't many places to hide in here. With nothing else to do, Matt and I come out with our hands up, and one of the men comes up to us and says the following. "Hi there. We're undercover police officers, and you've trespassed on private property. We're going to need you to come with us." He tries to convince us that he was a cop while holding up a torn piece of paper as some sort of identification. No matter how apologetic we were, they still insisted we go with them. With us being so young, we were convinced that they actually indeed were undercover cops, which, looking back, I should have known better. We walk over to the van with them, and it was at this point when Matt and I saw 3 more men in the back of the van. Praying to God that these men didn't understand Spanish, I told Matt that we had to run and he understood. Thankfully, they couldn't understand it because all they said was for us to shut it. As soon as they opened up the van, we both were greeted to the rest of the men, and I told Matt to run. The men cussed to themselves, and we both book it into the woods, running as fast as we could. We run for about 5 minutes before climbing up a tree. They eventually run past us and give up while walking back to their van in disappointment. Once they took off and I thought we were safe, we jumped down from the tree and booked it all the way back to my house, not looking back. Thankfully, my parents were home, but we didn't tell them anything about what had just taken place. We made up an excuse and stayed there for the rest of the night, and we never saw that van again. This happened to my mom when she was a kid, back in the early 2000s, and I still think it kinda messed her up a bit. To cut to the chase, my mom was 12 when this happened. She was home alone as both her parents, aka my grandparents, attended a work company event for their jobs. My mom had made plans with her friend earlier that day to hang out at the house together since she'd be home alone. At one point, my mom decides to take a shower and leaves a sticky note on the front door saying, "I'm in the shower, come on in," just in case her friend came while she was still showering. Fast forward till about 10 minutes later. She was still in the shower when she hears a knock on the bathroom door. Assuming it was her friend, she got a bit startled and says, "Oh, hey, I'll be right out." When she got out of the shower, she was unexpectedly surprised to see nobody there. A few minutes later, she's wrapped in a towel trying to find her friend to see where she could be hiding, figuring she was trying to scare her or something. When she can't find her, she gets a call from her friend telling her that she's on her way, and she pulls up into the driveway shortly after. My mom tells this story still till this day and sends chills down my spine.